Hey everybody, today I've got to put a new scope on my Christensen Arms BA TAC in 6.5 PRC. So I wanted to kind of do a video, walk through it and show you guys how I go about mounting my scope. The scope I'm going to be putting on it today is going to be a Vortex Viper PST, just a 3 to 15 by 44. Not super high power, but it's been a great scope for me. The rings I'm going to be using, I've got some Christensen Arms and Worn PRSR HD rings. So now these are a 3 screw per side ring. These ones are 30 millimeters. But what is really cool about these is right here we've got a built-in bubble level. It's removable, but right there you can screw it back in. And then on the other set we've even got a detachable data card. So these mount directly to your ring. So this is an awesome combination set. Removes adding bulky hardware to the top of your receiver. It's all built into the rings. So very good rings, very solid rings. Let's get started on putting them on. So a couple other things I do have. I've got a Wheeler fat wrench adjustable torque settings. For these I've got a 1/2 inch drive socket and T10 Torx wrench bit to tighten everything in. Okay, first thing we're gonna have is the back ring. So I'm a right-handed shooter, so I'm going to mount the bubble level on the left side. And for this one, I'm going to mount it as far back as possible because I do not want anything overhanging the ejection window with a rifle, because I don't want anything to try to eject and bounce off the scope rings and then end up falling back in the receiver causing jams. So that one I'm going to mount as far back as it clears. This one I'm going to come and mount and set right here in the front. So I've got my fat wrench. We are going to take this and adjust it to 65 inch-pounds to torque the bases onto the receivers. So just some twist adjust at the bottom. Take it to 60, tighten it, torque until it clicks. Okay, same thing in the front. Now, just to be sure, before we get everything else kind of set up, I want to set my scope in here, make sure I've got plenty of forward and back room to be able to set my eye relief. So you're going to come behind the gun, just kind of a quick setup, feel about where you'd be, move the scope back and forth, and yep, looks like the eye relief is going to be good in this position. So I'm not going to be worried about setting it yet. I've got a few more things I need to check first. Just wanted to make sure the rings were started mounting in the right position, make sure I had enough room to get them where I needed to go. So now, the other tool I've got here is I've got some scope alignment rings from Wheeler. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use these, and they are tapered down to a point, so I can put one in each ring, and I'm going to clamp these down and clamp them in, same diameter as the scope tube, and I'm going to see how tightly aligned my scope rings are. So I've got the top portions of the rings. Go ahead and put those on each side. And now I'm going to switch out 1/2 inch socket for the T10 wrench, and I'm going to back the torque down to 20 inch-pounds. Smaller screws don't need as much torque. Okay, so that's about 20. So I'm just going to get these started. I'm going to do just the corner screws kitty corner from each other on each one, just to start and get things not quite snug, but just started and close. Okay, so that side's a little too snug. I need to be able to move the alignment rings, the alignment bars. Okay, so I've got the adjustment bars. I'm going to align them until they're just about touching. And you want them to be the points about as close to the center between the two rings as possible. Now that I've got that set, I'm going to come and I am going to torque the first one down, alternating screws and alternating sides, because you don't want to build all the torque on one side. You want to spread it out evenly, just like you tighten lug nuts on a car. Okay, that side is now torqued in and set, so we'll still make sure it's aligned. Now we'll come and do the same thing here. So to get this when I get started, you can end up with one side of your rings pushing down on the bottom and the other side kind of lifted a little bit off the bases on the other side. It's not an issue. I like to hold them centered just to kind of keep the gaps even. Okay, we'll get that one just started. And now since it's already in position, we can go ahead and we'll start all the screws, and then we'll go back and do a final torque on everything just to get them kind of set in their position, but we don't want to over torque anything unevenly. Okay, so now what these do is these are the same size as your scope tube diameter, and they're both tapered to a point on the ends. And what that's going to do is show you the alignment of both of the scope rings. Since they're two separate pieces, you want to make sure they are as lined and perfectly centered as possible. Alright, now we're a little closer. Let's kind of take a closer look and see what we've ended up with. So because these two are tapered on the ends, you want the points to line up almost as perfectly aligned as possible, side to side and top to bottom. So I was actually going to use this video as a chance to kind of go over lapping the scope rings, because that's something I typically do to all my scope rings, but as you can see here, the way those points are lined up, these ones don't need it. So this is part of what you get when you buy quality products. These are precision machined, and as you can tell, those things are lined up and I do not need to lap these rings. So good components do make a difference. Alright, so we just took a look at these, and I'm not going to lie, as you can tell, buying good components makes this 10 times easier. Like I said, I was going to show you guys a little bit of how to lap the scope rings in place. Have to save that for another set of rings. These ones don't need it. Yeah, you spend the money, you buy good product, and you get good results. That's all it comes down to. So with the way these are lined up, I feel pretty good about just mounting my scope straight on now. So we're going to undo this, take the top caps off. And I will say, these ones I've got here, like I said earlier, do have the 3 screw holes, which gives you some serious clamping power. You do not need to worry about these things going anywhere. Very important aspect. It is pretty important to have a torque wrench when you're doing some of this. You do not want to over torque these scope rings, because what you can end up doing is kind of crushing and deforming your scope tube a little bit. And that is going to cause some issues kind of in your glass and in the clarity. Same with the reason on why I even check the alignment of the rings, because what happens is if your rings aren't aligned and you try to force your scope in there, you can set your scope in it, and when you torque down the rings, your scope is going to bend a little bit back and forth if they're not aligned. So you want to keep that scope as lined up as possible, just to keep from any clarity or distortion or optical issues that are going to come from improper mounting. And now before I take these all the way off, because I've already checked the alignment and I've torqued everything down to make sure they're good, I'm going to keep the front set with the front set and the rear set with the rear set, just because I know everything is already true. So we'll get rid of our alignment bars, and now we can go ahead and set our scope in. So here, let's say we'll get the back one on, we'll get the front one on. I'm going to come back here, get back in the gun, kind of close to your shooting position, and you can slide your scope back and forth, and then find the eye relief that works for you where the entire optic is clear. You don't want any darkening around the edges. You want a full, clear clarity from center to the edge of the glass. Okay, so about there. So I'm going to just torque these down just enough to get some tension on it, but I do not want to tighten them yet. Okay, so now all the rings are torqued down, and now I've actually torqued them a little bit too much, because now I can't move or rotate my scope, so I need to back them off a quarter turn again, just to not over torque everything, because I still need to move my scope into position. Okay, now I can move my scope. So the other thing that you are definitely going to want for this, what I've got here is I've got some Wheeler scope levels. Now there's some fancy reticle leveling tools and stuff like that you can use. I've just used these levels and they've worked great for me. They've got magnetic bases, so they can fit inside the receiver. Let's put one in, kind of show you guys a little bit how they work. So one thing you need to watch for though when you're putting these in a Remington 700 style receiver. So I'm going to go ahead and put this in, and they've got a magnetic base that's going to go and sit on the raceway. So when you got to be careful when you're putting these in, because since they're magnetic, they can actually come and stick to the top of the raceway. And that's going to give you some issues. So you want to make sure that that's pushed down and seated on the bottom of the raceway so that your level is going to be perfectly flat. Okay, and the other one you're going to want is they've got another one, and this one comes and sits right on top of the scope. Alright, so let's come up here now and take a little closer look at our levels. So here's the one that goes in the receiver raceway. So like I said, it's just flat on the bottom, has a magnetic base. I'm going to slip that inside the raceway and make sure it's seated on the bottom. But what I'm running into is because this is a integral rail receiver, I've got a lot more metal up in the top. So the magnet is not wanting to play nice and seat down to the bottom of the raceway. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to move it back here to where it's out of position. It doesn't have any metal above it, and it's staying stable. So now, best way to do this is in a gun vise, so you can kind of get everything into position and then lock it into place. I'm going to loosen this up here. Get my rifle rotated into position. And now I can go ahead and tighten everything up. Make sure that level is centered. So now this level is centered and level to my receiver. And now I'm just going to come up and I've got that sitting flat on my scope. If you do have a fiber optic indicator on the top of your scope turret, you do want to be careful and just make sure that that's not causing the bow level to sit funny in any way. But right here doesn't look too bad. We'll rotate that. Looks pretty nice and center. Come back and check the receiver level, and now they are both centered, meaning the scope is lined up with the receiver. Okay, now we checked the levels. Scope is level with the receiver, meaning everything's lined up, which if you saw my other video talking about scope cant and how that can kind of affect downrange, this receiver has a 20 MOA rail built into it, meaning that it actually slopes down, so rifle cant's even more important here because everything's going to be exaggerated. But now that we've got it lined up, we can take the levels off. I've still got my torque wrench set to 20. Now I can go through and start to tighten things up. So the same pattern as before, kind of like changing a car tire, alternating lugs. Get them started to where you start feeling resistance, and then go back and do the final torque on them. And all the screws are tightened, and just as kind of a secondary check to make sure I didn't bump anything when I was torquing those on, we'll put my level back on the scope, put the level back on the receiver, and everything still lines up good. Didn't bump my scope when I was putting it on. So now the handy thing with this is I like doing it this way, is because now that this scope is mounted to these rings and we know that everything is true, because these have just kind of this nut on the side, I just leave the scope rings with the scope. You can just come and unscrew these two nuts, take the entire scope set off, and then next time you go to put the scope set on, you know that the scope is truly level to these rings. So there you go, you can kind of reuse them, swap them between guns, and then you'll just have to kind of re-zero, but the trueness of the scope still stays the same. Alright, so if you made it this far without being bored to death, thank you, I appreciate it. If you want to use the tools that I used in today's video, I've got a link either in my bio or my about page to Wheeler Tools. You can use the code LRS10 for long range science, LRS10 for 10% off your order. Like I said, they do everything from the torque wrench I've got to scope rings to all the driver bits, and even a little bit fancier reticle leveling tools than I use today. So go check that out if you want to do this. Great tools, I've used them for a long time. Go check them out. Thanks.